The night was colder than anything Aaron had ever known. His breath turned into white mist the moment it left his mouth, and his hands shook even inside the torn gloves he wore. He sat beside the small flame he had managed to create with his survival kit. The fire was weak, but it gave him life. Without it, he knew he would not last even a single night on this frozen world. Aaron had been traveling through the outer trade routes when his ship was struck by a sudden storm of ice and debris. The crash threw him into a land that looked endless, covered with frozen mountains and sharp winds that screamed like wild animals. He had little food, less water, and only one tool that could still make fire. For hours after the crash, he searched through the wreck, taking anything that might help him live. Now he sat in a cave, guarding the small fire as though it were his only treasure. The wind outside grew louder. Aaron pulled his coat tighter and stared at the flame. He wondered if rescue would ever come. His signal beacon was broken. The galaxy was wide, and he was just one lost human. He felt loneliness pressing down on him heavier than the cold itself. It was then that he heard something strange. At first, it sounded like a soft cry carried by the wind. He thought it was his mind playing tricks. But the sound came again, closer this time. Aaron stood, holding a broken piece of metal like a weapon. He stepped toward the mouth of the cave, his boots crunching against the frozen ground. Two figures appeared in the darkness. They moved slowly, their steps weak, almost broken. As they came closer, the firelight touched them, and Aaron saw they were not human. They were sisters, though different from him in every way. Their skin was pale with a faint shimmer, like frost under moonlight. Their hair was long and dark, falling across their shoulders in tangled strands. Their eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the firelight with a strange silver shine. They looked thin, tired, and frightened. Aaron tightened his grip on the metal shard, unsure if they were dangerous. But then he noticed something else. They were shivering. Their arms were wrapped tightly around their own bodies, and their teeth chattered as though they had been walking in the storm for far too long. One of them stepped forward. She tried to speak, her voice soft and broken, but Aaron could not understand the words. She pointed toward the fire with trembling hands. The other sister followed, her eyes wide with fear and hope. Aaron's heart pounded. He had little fuel for the fire. If he shared its heat with them, it might burn out sooner. But when he saw the desperation on their faces, he could not push them away. With a slow nod, he stepped aside, letting them move closer. The sisters rushed to the flame, crouching near it with their hands stretched out. Their shivering slowed, and their breathing steadied. One of them closed her eyes as though she had found safety for the first time in many days. The other looked at Aaron with silent gratitude, her lips forming a word he did not know. Aaron sat back down, still cautious, but no longer holding the shard so tightly. The fire crackled between them, giving warmth to all three. For a while, no one spoke. The storm outside howled, but inside the cave there was only the sound of fire and slow breaths. When their shivering finally stopped, the older sister tried again to speak. She placed her hand on her chest and said, "Kale." Then she touched the younger sister's shoulder and said, "Nira." Aaron understood. He pointed to himself and said, "Aaron." Kale nodded slowly. Nira whispered his name, her voice soft but clear. It was a small bridge between them, but it was enough. They were no longer strangers without names. As the night went on, Aaron noticed how the sisters stayed close to the flame as though afraid it might vanish. He realized the truth: they could not survive without heat. Their bodies seemed weaker against the cold than his own. Without fire, they would die quickly. Aaron thought about his limited fuel again. He had only a few sticks, some broken parts of his ship, and what little was left of his starter kit. If he was careful, he might survive a week. But with the sisters, the fire would need to burn longer and brighter. His chances of living had just fallen. Yet, as he looked at Kale and Nira sitting together, their silver eyes reflecting the firelight, he felt something change inside him. For the first time since the crash, he was not alone. The hours passed slowly. The storm outside grew violent, shaking the cave walls. At one point, the wind nearly blew out the fire, and all three rushed to protect it. Aaron held his body against the opening while the sisters cupped their hands around the flame. Together, they kept it alive. When the storm finally calmed, exhaustion pulled at Aaron's body. He leaned against the wall, his eyes heavy. Before sleep claimed him, he saw Kale sitting upright, watching the cave entrance like a guard. Nira rested close to the fire, her head tilted against her sister's shoulder. Aaron closed his eyes, comforted by the thought that he was not alone in the cold anymore. Somewhere in the silence of that frozen world, a bond had begun, born from fire and survival. By morning, the sun rose pale and distant, but the flame still burned. Aaron woke to see the sisters still near him. They had not left. They showed no sign of leaving. The fire he had shared had tied them together, and though none of them could say it in words, they already knew they would not walk away from each other. Not now, not ever. The second day on the frozen world began with silence. The storm had passed, leaving behind a clear sky that glowed with pale light. The air was sharp and cold, biting against the skin, but inside the cave the fire still burned. Aaron opened his eyes slowly, surprised to see that he was still alive. Beside him, the two sisters sat close to the flame. Kale was awake, her silver eyes watching the cave entrance, her body stiff like a soldier on duty. Nira slept lightly, her head resting on her sister's shoulder, her breathing steady but soft. When Aaron moved, Kale turned her gaze to him and gave a small nod. It was not a smile, but it carried respect. Aaron stretched his arms and rubbed his hands together. His body ached from the cold night, but he forced himself to stand. The fire had eaten much of the wood and scraps he had gathered yesterday. If he did not find more fuel, they would freeze before the next storm came. "I need to search," Aaron said, pointing to the entrance of the cave. He mimed gathering and carrying, hoping they would understand. Kale tilted her head, then spoke to Nira in her own language. Nira's eyes opened slowly. She looked at Aaron, then at the fire, and shook her head as if afraid he would leave. Aaron crouched beside the younger sister and placed a hand on his chest. "I will come back," he said softly. He tapped the ground with his boot, then pointed outside again. Nira studied his face carefully. She seemed uncertain, but at last she lowered her eyes and stayed quiet. With the shard of metal in his hand, Aaron stepped outside. The cold air struck him like knives, but he pushed forward. He searched near the wreckage of his ship, gathering broken panels, burned wires, and pieces of wood from shattered crates. Each step was heavy, and the snow crunched loudly under his boots. He kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see strange creatures watching him from the hills. When he returned, his arms full of supplies, Kale was waiting at the cave mouth. She hurried forward, taking some of the weight from him. Together they placed everything near the fire. Nira clapped her hands softly, her face showing a rare smile. Aaron felt a small warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. The three of them worked together. Aaron built the flame higher with wood and scrap, while Kale watched carefully, learning each movement of his hands. Nero placed small stones in a circle around the fire, as if marking it as their own. When the flames grew stronger, the sisters both relaxed, their shoulders no longer trembling. Later, Kale tried to speak again. She touched her chest and said her name slowly. Kale. She then pointed at her sister. Nira. Finally, she looked at Aaron, waiting. Aaron smiled faintly and said, Aaron. The sisters repeated his name. The sound was rough in their voices, but it carried warmth. Then Kale pressed a hand against her heart and spoke a word he did not know. She repeated it again, pointing to all three of them. Nira joined her, saying the same word with a gentle tone. Aaron understood it was something important. He guessed it meant together, or maybe family. Though he could not say it perfectly, he tried. His attempt was clumsy, and the sound came out wrong, but Nero laughed softly, covering her mouth, while Kale's eyes softened with approval. From that moment, the silence between them grew lighter. In the afternoon, Aaron showed them how to arrange rocks at the entrance of the cave to block some of the wind. Kale quickly joined him, lifting stones and setting them firmly in place. She was stronger than she looked, though her movements carried a trace of weariness. Nira stayed close to the fire, humming softly as she cleaned the cave floor of snow with her hands. When they rested, Aaron took out a small ration bar from his pocket. It was his last full piece of food. His stomach ached with hunger, but when he looked at the sisters, he could not keep it for himself. He broke it into 3 parts and handed 2 of them to Kale and Nira. Nira hesitated, but Kale accepted hers and nodded once more. They ate slowly, as though trying to make the taste last longer. Aaron chewed his share in silence, knowing that soon they would all face hunger again. Still, he felt better seeing their strength return. As night approached, the wind began to rise again. The cave grew darker, and the flame became the only light. Nero moved closer to it, holding her hands above the heat. Kale sat beside her, keeping watch with sharp eyes. Aaron leaned back against the wall, his body tired from the day's work. Then came a sound outside. It was faint, like claws scratching across ice. Aaron sat up quickly, his hand reaching for the shard of metal. Kale heard it too, her body stiffening, her head turning sharply toward the entrance. Nira froze in place, her eyes wide. The sound faded after a moment, leaving only the howl of the wind. But Aaron knew what he had heard. Something was moving out there. He looked at Kale. She met his eyes and gave a small nod, as if to say she had heard it too. Without words, they agreed to be cautious. The fire burned brightly, pushing back the shadows. The sisters stayed close to it, and Aaron kept his weapon ready beside him. For the first time, he felt not just the need to survive for himself, but also the need to protect those who had placed their trust in his flame. The night passed slowly. At times, Aaron felt his eyes closing, but each time he drifted, he saw Kale still awake, her gaze never leaving the cave entrance. Nero leaned against her sister, asleep but safe. By the time dawn came again, the scratching sound had not returned. The fire was still alive, though weaker. The 3 survivors were still together. Aaron looked at the sisters, then at the small flame. He understood more clearly than before. This fire was not only warmth. It was a promise. As long as he kept it alive, Kale and Nero would stay by his side. And he knew he would do everything in his power to keep that promise. The 3rd day began with a gray sky. Clouds hung low, heavy with snow. The air was still for a time, but Aaron felt in his bones that another storm was coming. He sat by the fire, feeding it with the last of the broken wood from the wreck. Kale and Nira sat close, their eyes watching the flame as though it was more than fire. To them, it was life itself. Aaron studied the sisters. Kale was calm and strong, but her face carried lines of worry that no young person should have. She guarded her sister like a shield, always placing herself between Nira and danger. Nira was softer, her movements gentle, her silver eyes full of quiet wonder. She often looked at Aaron with curiosity, as if she wanted to ask questions she could not yet speak. Aaron felt a strange comfort in their presence. He had lost everything in the crash, but now he was not alone. Still, his mind could not rest. The fuel for the fire was almost gone. Without it, none of them would survive. He stood and picked up the shard of metal. "I will find more," he said, though he knew they could not understand his words. He pointed at the fire, then at the open air outside. Kale rose to her feet at once. She placed a hand on her chest and said her name firmly, then pointed at him. She wanted to come. Aaron shook his head. The cold and danger outside were too great. But Kale stepped forward, her eyes sharp, her posture unbending. It was clear she would not let him go alone. Nira tugged at her sister's arm, her face full of fear, but Kale placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. She spoke to her in soft tones, then turned back to Aaron. At last, Aaron gave in. Together, he and Kale left the cave, leaving Nira by the fire. The world outside was a frozen desert. Snow covered the ground, and the wind pushed against them with icy fingers. Aaron pulled his coat tighter and scanned the land. Broken pieces of his ship lay scattered across the hills. Some metal parts might burn if handled carefully, but he hoped to find real wood from the crates or storage. Kale walked beside him, silent but alert. Her steps were light, even in the snow. From time to time, she touched his arm and pointed, showing him sharp rocks or hidden cracks where he might trip. Aaron noticed how her eyes never stopped moving. She was guarding him, just as she guarded her sister. They worked together, gathering scraps and splinters. Aaron carried most of the load, while Kale kept watch. By the time they returned, their arms were heavy but their firewood pile had grown. Nira greeted them with a bright smile, rushing forward to help. For a moment, all three felt proud. The flame could live another night. But the storm came sooner than expected. That evening, the wind rose like a wild beast. Snow slammed into the cave, and the cold rushed in like a river of ice. The fire bent and hissed, nearly dying under the force of the storm. Aaron shouted in fear, dropping to his knees to shield the flame with his body. Kale moved without hesitation. She crouched beside him, spreading her arms to block the wind. Nira joined them, covering the fire with her small frame. The three pressed close, forming a circle of flesh and cloth around a tiny glow. The storm screamed outside, filling the cave with noise and terror. The fire flickered low, almost nothing but smoke. Aaron's heart pounded. If the flame died, it would never return. They would all freeze before morning. With trembling hands, he struck the flint again and again, feeding sparks into the dying embers. Kale's voice rose in a sharp cry, urging him on in her own language. Nira pressed closer, her face pale with fear. Finally, the sparks caught. The fire grew back into a small but living flame. The three held their breath as it steadied, the glow reflecting in their eyes. Relief spread through them like a second kind of warmth. Hours passed, and still they held their guard. The wind tried to steal the flame again and again, but they refused to let it die. Their bodies shook with cold, but none of them pulled away. It was as if the fire had become their child, and they would give everything to protect it. At last, the storm began to fade. The wind grew weaker, the snow settled, and silence returned. Aaron slumped against the wall, his strength gone. Kale lowered her arms, her breath ragged, while Nero leaned heavily against her sister. All three were exhausted, but the fire still lived. For the first time since the crash, Aaron let out a laugh. It was small and broken, but it came from his heart. Kale looked at him, confused, then allowed herself a short laugh as well. Nira joined them, her voice light and musical. The sound filled the cave, chasing away the shadows left by the storm. Afterward, Nira reached for Aaron's hand. She pointed at the fire, then spoke a word he remembered from before. Kale repeated it, her tone steady. Aaron tried again to copy the sound. This time, it came closer to the truth. Both sisters smiled. The word meant together. That night, they sat close around the fire, no longer strangers but a small family bound by survival. Aaron watched the sisters as they drifted into sleep, Kale still holding Nira in her arms. His eyes grew heavy, but his heart was lighter than before. He knew more storms would come. He knew danger still waited in the frozen dark. But as long as they had fire, and as long as they had each other, they had hope. Aaron closed his eyes, the glow of the flame warming his face. In his last thoughts before sleep, he realized something that made him stronger than the cold. He was no longer just one man fighting to survive. He was part of something greater. He was part of them. The morning after the storm was calm. The air outside the cave was still and heavy, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The sky was pale, the sun little more than a dim circle behind the clouds. Snow stretched in every direction, smooth and untouched, hiding whatever lay beneath. Aaron woke with stiff muscles and tired eyes, but the sight of the fire still burning filled him with quiet relief. Beside him, Kale was awake as always, her sharp gaze fixed on the cave entrance. Nira slept soundly, her face soft in the glow of the flames. Aaron rose to his feet and stretched. He felt hunger gnawing at his stomach, sharper now than before. He had not eaten since yesterday, and he could see the same weakness in the sisters' faces. Food was becoming just as dangerous a problem as fuel. He decided to search the wreck again. Before leaving, he stepped to the entrance of the cave to study the land. That was when he saw something that made his chest tighten. Tracks. In the snow not far from the cave, a line of marks wound across the ground. They were wide and deep, too large for any human, and shaped like claws. Aaron followed them with his eyes until they disappeared into the hills. He turned back quickly. Kale saw his expression and stood at once. Aaron crouched and drew the shape of the tracks on the ground with his finger. Kale studied it, then her face hardened. She nodded in grim understanding. When Nira woke, Kale explained with short words in their language. Nira's eyes widened with fear. She clutched her sister's arm, whispering something quick and worried. Kale pulled her close, speaking in calm tones, but her own face remained tense. Aaron felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. The storm had been their first trial, but now something else had found them. Something alive. Something hunting. He knew they could not run. Without fire, they would freeze. If the creature returned, they had only one choice to fight. Aaron searched the wreck again that day, not for food, but for anything that could serve as weapons. He found sharp metal scraps, broken rods, and wires. Kale helped him carry them back. Together, they built simple traps at the cave entrance. They dug shallow pits, lined them with sharp fragments, and covered them with snow. They tied loose wires across the ground where something large might trip. Nira gathered stones and placed them in piles near the fire. She was not strong, but her eyes burned with determination. She wanted to help, and Aaron did not stop her. As the day faded into night, the fear grew heavier. They sat close to the fire, listening to the silence outside. Every sound of wind or shifting snow made them flinch. Aaron kept the shard of metal in his hand. Kale gripped a broken rod. Nira held one of the stones tightly, her knuckles white. The night stretched long. Hours passed without a sign of danger, and Aaron almost believed the tracks belonged to something long gone. But just as his eyes began to close, Kale hissed a warning. Two glowing eyes appeared in the darkness outside the cave. The creature stepped forward slowly, its shape large and hunched. Its body was covered in pale fur that blended with the snow, but its claws gleamed like black knives. Its breath steamed in the air as it growled low, the sound rumbling through the stone walls of the cave. Nira pressed close to her sister, trembling, but she did not cry out. Aaron felt fear grip his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. The traps were waiting. All they needed was courage. The beast moved closer, its glowing eyes fixed on the fire. When it stepped on the loose wire, a sharp snap echoed, and the creature stumbled forward. Kale shouted and hurled her rod, striking its side. The beast roared in anger, swiping at the air. Aaron rushed forward, slashing with his shard of metal. The blade cut across the beast's arm, not deep, but enough to make it recoil. Nira threw her stone, striking its head with a sharp crack. The creature roared again, this time with pain. In its rage, it leapt toward them, but its weight collapsed one of the hidden pits. It fell with a howl as sharp metal pierced its leg. Kale moved fast. She grabbed another rod and struck again and again. Aaron joined her, slashing until the beast pulled itself free and staggered back into the snow. Bleeding and limping, it snarled once more, then turned and vanished into the night. Silence returned, broken only by their heavy breaths. For a long moment, none of them moved. Then Nero let out a small sob of relief and fell against her sister. Kale wrapped her arms around her, holding her close. Aaron lowered his weapon, his hands shaking. The fire still burned, untouched. The cave was safe for now. Aaron sat down hard, his strength gone. He looked at Kale and Nira. Their faces were pale, but their eyes shone with fierce light. They had fought together and survived. The fear was still there, but so was something stronger. That night, none of them slept deeply. Kale kept her weapon close, her gaze fixed on the entrance. Aaron forced himself to rest with one hand on his shard. Nira stayed between them, her eyes closed but her body pressed against the warmth of the fire. When the first light of dawn touched the snow, they were still alive. Aaron knew the creature would not forget them. It might return, or others might follow. But he also knew something else. The bond between him and the sisters had grown stronger than before. They were no longer strangers tied by chance. They were a small family bound by fire, courage, and blood. The sun rose weak and pale over the frozen land, yet its light did little to warm the world. Inside the cave, the fire still burned, though smaller than the night before. Aaron crouched near it, feeding the last of the scraps they had gathered. He knew the truth in his heart. Their fuel would not last much longer. Kale stood at the entrance, her sharp eyes scanning the snow. Nira sat close to the fire, humming softly as she warmed her hands. Both sisters carried the memory of the night before, when the creature had come. Fear lingered in their eyes, but so did strength. They had fought and survived. Aaron's stomach growled with hunger, but he pushed the thought away. He needed to focus on keeping the fire alive. Without it, there would be no tomorrow for any of them. He rose to his feet. "I must search the wreck again," he said quietly, though he knew the sisters could not understand his words. Still, Kale turned to him as if she felt his meaning. She gave a firm nod and reached for her rod. She would not let him go alone. Together they walked through the snow. The wind was light that morning, but the cold was sharp enough to bite through their clothes. The wreckage lay scattered across the white ground, broken and half buried. Aaron searched through every corner, pulling open frozen panels, breaking apart crates, and testing wires. Most of it was useless. But then Nira, who had followed despite her sister's warning, gave a soft cry of surprise. She knelt beside a broken storage box and pulled out a cluster of strange crystals. They were rough and clear, shaped like jagged stars. When Nira touched two of them together, sparks leapt out and a faint red glow spread through the stones. Aaron's eyes widened. He took the crystals carefully, feeling the warmth that pulsed from them. They were unlike anything he had seen before. Perhaps they had been stored for trade, or maybe they were part of the ship's energy system. Whatever they were, they could burn. Hope stirred in his chest. He gathered as many as he could carry, and the three hurried back to the cave. There, Aaron placed the crystals near the fire. With careful strikes of his flint, he sent sparks into them. At once, they flared to life, glowing brighter and hotter than wood. The fire grew stronger, filling the cave with a deep warmth. The sisters gasped in wonder. Nira clapped her hands together, her silver eyes shining. Kale touched one of the glowing stones and quickly pulled her hand back from the heat. She looked at Aaron with respect, speaking words he could not understand but whose meaning was clear. He had given them more than warmth. He had given them hope. From that moment, the sisters called him Fire Giver. Though the words in their tongue were strange, Aaron understood. They looked to him not only as a companion but as the one who carried the power to keep them alive. For the first time since the crash, Aaron felt pride. He was not helpless. He was not just waiting for rescue. He could shape the world around him, even in this frozen wasteland. That night, the fire burned higher than ever. Its glow lit the cave walls, pushing back the shadows. The sisters sat close to Aaron, their faces calm and filled with warmth. Nero leaned against his shoulder as she hummed a soft tune. Kale sat tall beside them, her eyes softer than before. Aaron looked at the flames and felt something deep inside him shift. The fire was more than survival. It was a bond tying them together. If he left, they would have nothing. If he stayed, they had a chance. The days that followed were easier. With the crystals, the fire grew stronger and steadier. They no longer feared every gust of wind. They no longer counted every stick of wood. For the first time, they felt secure. Aaron used the extra time to teach them small things. He showed Kale how to strike the flint, how to feed the crystals carefully. She learned quickly, her hands steady and sure. Nero laughed each time she tried, her sparks always too small, but her joy made the lessons light. The sisters, in turn, shared with him pieces of their language. Simple words at first. Fire. Together. Safe. Aaron repeated them clumsily, but Kale corrected him with patient tones while Nira giggled at his mistakes. Slowly, the silence between them filled with sound, and their bond grew stronger. Yet even with warmth and trust, Aaron's heart carried a heavy truth. The signal beacon was still broken. No rescue had come. The frozen world stretched endless in every direction. The crystals gave them fire, but not food. Hunger still gnawed at them each day. One evening, as the fire crackled bright, Nero leaned close and whispered a word into his ear. Aaron did not know its meaning, but her voice was filled with hope. Kale watched him closely, her silver eyes reflecting the flames. Aaron knew what they were asking without words. They wanted him to stay, to keep giving them fire. He looked at the sisters and then at the glowing crystals. He thought of the empty stars above, of the rescue that might never come. His home felt far away, like a dream. Here, beside the fire, with Kale and Nira near him, he felt something real. Something worth holding onto. That night, as the three of them sat close around the fire, Aaron placed his hand on his chest and spoke slowly. Aaron, stay. The sisters tilted their heads, not fully understanding, but when Kale repeated the word stay and Nira smiled, he knew they felt his meaning. The fire burned higher, the cave filled with warmth, and for the first time since the crash, Aaron allowed himself to believe in a future. The fire burned brightly, filling the cave with warmth that seemed almost magical. Outside, the frozen world stretched endlessly, pale and silent under the weak sun. Aaron, Kale, and Nira sat close together, sharing the glow of the crystals. For a while, there was peace. The storms had passed, and the tracks of creatures in the snow had disappeared. But Aaron's heart felt heavy. His thoughts were not on fire or warmth. They were on the stars above, and the hope of being rescued. His signal beacon, though damaged, had finally begun to emit a faint pulse. Soon, human ships might come. Rescue would arrive. The thought of it filled him with both relief and doubt. Kale noticed his silence. Her sharp silver eyes studied him closely. Nira, sensing something too, pressed closer to her sister. Both sisters waited, their faces open but tense, as though expecting a choice to be made. Aaron knew what he must decide. He could leave this frozen world, return to the warmth and safety of human life, and let the sisters remain behind. Or he could stay, abandoning the promise of rescue to remain with them. His chest ached at the thought. The fire they shared had brought them together, but leaving might save his own life. That evening, the sky turned dark, clouds thick and heavy. The wind whispered through the hills, and the firelight flickered against the cave walls. Aaron watched Kale and Nira, seeing their trust and quiet hope. Neither spoke, but their eyes said everything. They did not want him to leave. Kale finally broke the silence. She placed a hand on her chest, then pointed to Aaron. Her voice was soft but firm. Stay. Nira reached out as well, touching his arm gently. Her eyes glimmered in the firelight. Please, she whispered, though he could not understand the exact words. Her meaning was clear. They wanted him to stay with them, to keep giving them fire and warmth. Aaron closed his eyes. The stars above, distant and cold, called to him. The life he knew waited among them. Yet here, in this small cave, fire and survival had formed something different. Something more powerful. The bond between him and the sisters was stronger than any call from home. He thought of the first night, when he had shared his small flame with them. He remembered the shivering, the fear, and the quiet trust that had begun then. Every day since, that trust had grown, becoming something he could not abandon. Aaron opened his eyes and looked at the fire. The crystals glowed warmly, reflecting the hope in their faces. He knew the choice he had to make. Rescue might come, but the sisters could not survive alone. He could not leave them behind. "I stay," Aaron said softly. The words felt heavy and light at the same time. Kale's eyes widened, and Nira's lips curved into a small smile. They repeated the words in their own language, their voices full of relief and joy. For the first time, Aaron felt a sense of certainty. The decision was not about fear or comfort. It was about what mattered most. Fire, warmth, survival, and the trust they had built together. He would stay. He would protect them, and together, they would face the frozen world. That night, they prepared for what might come. Aaron strengthened the fire circle, placing crystals and stones carefully so the flame would last. Kale sharpened the rods and set them near the entrance, ready for any threat. Nira gathered small piles of snow to keep water nearby, her hands careful but precise. Each of them worked in quiet harmony, their bond stronger than any words could describe. As the night deepened, Aaron sat with the sisters close to him. He spoke softly, teaching them more words, sharing stories of distant worlds and stars, and reminding them of the hope they now carried together. Kale listened intently, occasionally asking questions with sharp gestures. Nero laughed at his clumsy attempts to show the stars with his hands. Their voices filled the cave, making it feel less like a place of survival and more like a home. Hours passed without danger. The wind was quiet, the snow settled, and the fire burned steadily. Aaron's heart felt light. He had made the choice, and though it carried risks, it brought a sense of peace he had never felt before. The sisters were no longer just companions. They were family. Before sleep, Aaron touched the crystals. The flame reflected in Kale's and Nira's silver eyes. "We survive," he whispered, though the words were for all three of them. The sisters nodded, leaning close to him. Together, they felt the warmth not just of the fire, but of trust and belonging. The choice had been made. Rescue could wait. The frozen world was harsh and unforgiving, but they had each other. That was enough. As the cave grew quiet, Aaron closed his eyes, listening to the soft breathing of Kale and Nira. The fire burned bright between them. In that moment, he understood something important. Survival was not just about warmth or food. It was about the bonds formed in the face of danger. The flame they shared was more than fire. It was hope, trust, and the beginning of a life none of them would ever forget. The night stretched on, but fear no longer ruled them. Aaron stayed, and the sisters stayed with him. The choice to remain had given them all a new strength. The frozen world could test them, but the bond they carried was stronger than any storm, any creature, or any cold that tried to break them. The morning came quietly. Light spread slowly across the frozen hills, painting the snow in pale shades of blue and white. Aaron stirred by the fire, watching the sisters sleep. Kale sat upright, her silver eyes already scanning the cave entrance. Nero leaned against her sister, her breathing steady but soft. The warmth of the fire glowed between them, stronger than ever. The faint pulse of Aaron's signal beacon had finally been detected. A human ship was on its way. Rescue could come within hours. The thought should have brought joy, but Aaron felt his chest tighten. Leaving was no longer simple. The sisters had become his family. Their trust, their smiles, their small hands pressed against his own. It was impossible to leave them behind. Kale noticed his silence. She walked to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. Her eyes held questions, but also understanding. Nira stirred, sensing the change in him. She touched his arm and whispered something soft, her words filled with hope and fear at the same time. Aaron took a deep breath. The ship might save his life, but it could not replace the bond he had with the sisters. He looked at Kale and Nira, and the decision became clear. Rescue would not mean leaving them. He would take them with him, no matter the risk. When the human ship appeared as a bright dot in the sky, it grew larger with every passing minute. The hull shimmered in the pale light, and the sound of engines reached the cave, low and distant. Aaron moved to the fire, holding the sisters close. Kale and Nero looked at him with wide eyes. They understood, without words, that their lives were about to change forever. The crew landed cautiously, scanning the frozen ground. Aaron stepped forward, signaling with his hands that they were not dangerous. Kale stepped beside him, her silver eyes fixed on the ship. Nero followed, holding his hand. The crew paused for a moment, studying the sisters. Their appearance was strange and unfamiliar, but they did not hesitate to allow them aboard. The cave faded behind them as they walked toward the ship. The crystals glowed faintly in Aaron's pack, keeping the sisters warm. The human crew moved carefully, but they understood that the sisters were companions, not threats. The engines hummed, and soon the ground below them began to vanish as the ship lifted. Inside the cabin, the sisters stayed close to Aaron. Nira rested her head on his shoulder, while Kale stood watch by the window, her sharp eyes scanning the frozen land below. They were quiet, but the bond between them was stronger than ever. The warmth of the fire, though distant, lived in their hearts. Aaron held their hands in his own. He spoke softly, telling them that they were safe now. The human crew moved around them, preparing for the journey home. Though the sisters could not understand everything, they felt the calm and the trust in his voice. The stars stretched outside the windows, vast and unending. Aaron thought of the frozen world they had left behind. It had been harsh, dangerous, and cold. Yet it had given them something that nothing else could: the fire of trust and the bond of survival. Together, they had faced storms, predators, and hunger. They had protected one another and kept hope alive. Kale finally spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "Fire giver," she said, touching Aaron's hand. Nira repeated it softly, smiling. Aaron smiled back, understanding the meaning clearly now. They had given him a new name, not just for survival, but for love, trust, and family. Hours passed as the ship traveled through space. The sisters slowly relaxed, leaning against him, feeling the safety they had never known on the frozen world. Aaron watched them, his heart full. He had chosen them, and they had chosen him. Together, they were more than survivors. They were a family. The ship crew eventually left them alone in a small cabin. Aaron placed the crystals in a circle around the sisters, creating a small glow that reminded them of the fire back on the frozen world. Nira's eyes sparkled as she watched the flame dance, and Kale's gaze softened as she studied the warmth. Aaron knelt beside them. "Together," he whispered. The sisters nodded. Their hands touched his, their fingers entwined with his. No words were needed. The bond they had formed was stronger than anything the galaxy could offer. When the ship finally approached a human colony, Aaron felt a mix of emotions. Relief, for rescue. Excitement, for home. But also hope, because he knew the sisters would not be alone. They had found a place in a world that had once seemed vast and cruel. The fire they had shared on the frozen world had become something larger, a bond that could survive any distance, any danger. As the ship landed, Aaron led Kale and Nira onto the solid ground. The human crew greeted them warmly, curious but respectful of the sisters. Aaron held their hands firmly, guiding them forward. They were no longer weak or frightened. They had survived together, and now they would step into a new life side by side. The crystals in Aaron's pack were carefully placed near the new shelter. The glow reminded them of the first fire they had shared in the cave. Kale and Nira touched them gently, their fingers tracing the jagged edges. They smiled at him, their eyes full of gratitude and trust. Aaron watched them, feeling a quiet pride. Humanity had brought him to the stars, but the fire he shared had created something deeper. Trust, love, and family could survive anywhere, even in the coldest, most dangerous corners of the universe. That night, as the colony settled into quiet, the three sat together, sharing warmth and silence. They no longer feared storms or the unknown. The fire in their hearts burned brighter than any crystal. It was a promise, a bond, and a new beginning. Aaron knew the journey was not over. They would face new challenges, new dangers, and new worlds. But for now, they were together, safe, and strong. Kale leaned against him, Nira pressed close, and Aaron held them both. The fire they shared on the frozen world had never left. It lived in them, in trust, and in love. The stars outside twinkled quietly, endless and bright. Inside, the fire burned, and for the first time, all three of them felt that they truly belonged. The story of the frozen world, the storm, and the fire had ended, but the story of Aaron, Kale, and Nira was only beginning. Together, they would face the galaxy, not as strangers, not as survivors, but as a family bound by the flame they had shared.